you thought about context with your investment planning? This week, we're speaking with a leader in thought leadership with regard to how people make better wealth decisions within context of the broader global economy. A lot of people don't think about how the environment and the ability to regenerate things will have an impact on their decision making. And I think that's a bit short-sighted. We're going to talk about how that is, why that is, and how you should be thinking about your portfolio so that you can make better wealth decisions using proper context.
This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast dedicated to helping pre-retirees and retirees manage risk and economic uncertainty by adopting a pension-style approach to improve your risk-return trade-off. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto.
This week, we're speaking with Anthony Upward. He is a thought leader in the future of business, which is something that we don't usually talk about on this podcast. We're going to do some interesting stuff this week. Anthony, how are you?
I'm very good. Thanks very much, John. Thanks for inviting me on.
What it is you do and why you would call yourself a thought leader with regard to the future of business.
So after spending 25 years in management consulting, in very traditional management consulting, advising organizations about how to transform themselves using information technology to achieve financial objectives, I realized that, and I'm a fellow of the Canadian Association of Management Consultants, so I take my professional designation pretty seriously. I started to realize that in my profession, and in fact in business in general, I really had no idea for the context for what it was that I was doing. So I like to say sometimes that I was like an ear, nose and throat doctor who actually didn't know anything about the rest of the body down here and didn't know anything about the rest of the body up here. And obviously that would make for a very bad doctor because you need the doctor to be able to connect the whole system together. And so just over 15 years ago, I went back and did a graduate degree at the Schulich School of Business and the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. And the big question that I asked in that is, what is the context for business and how might that change, in particular, business models that take account of that? And of course, we know from reports such as the one that KPMG did about in 2012, Expect the Unexpected, that increasingly it's that context that is driving the things that have always been important to business decisions. So customer preference, price volatility, raw material availability, physical infrastructure from the natural environment, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole range of both environmental and social factors are now driving the things that have always driven financial performance.
So the thing that I never, ever forget about whenever I'm speaking with you and you talk about context is the way the financial services industry is evolving and the way traditional neoliberal economics has come to be viewed. Most economists will say, well, it's the study of the allocation of scarce resources in order to achieve optimal outcomes. And on in the investing side, you talk about how self-interested market participants will make decisions that are best for them. And on the one hand, this podcast has spoken with a number of behavioralists who will say, well, that's all fine and well when you talk about a system of people that are presumptively able to make those sorts of self-interested decisions, even though there's a mountain of evidence to show that that's actually not what people do. Similarly, the thing that I find fascinating with you is the context of a lot of business decisions being made in the context of, we're going to work on the assumption that resources are limitless and non-depleting, and that they will not have a deleterious impact on the environment and by extension the economy and the ability to continue to earn the revenues that we've been enjoying over the years based on a business model that is narrow in its focus. Maybe you could offer a little more background with regard to the context on the environmental side, because I've already given you a broad, background about how you fit in compared to the behavioralists. But what specific things do most economic models fail to take into account these days?
Well, I'd say if you take your average economics 101 course that might be taught in any university program today, or any microeconomic course that would be taught in a business school today, I would say they are entirely lacking in context. The models that you find in today's microeconomic textbooks at business schools have firms and households connected by flows of money and goods and services. Maybe they'll mention government and taxes, but that's about it. There's almost no mention, if any at all, of the edge of that economic system and how it might interface into society more generally, or that the idea that the economy is there in service of society's members to help them better meet their needs. And there's certainly very little, if any, connection to the wider environment, which of course is the ultimate source of our raw materials and the ultimate sink for all the waste that is generated by that economic system. And the science, the Earth system science is very clear on the environmental side of things that those flows out from the economy, which do exist into the environment, and the inflows from the environment through society into the economy are removing the very basis for our ability to survive, let alone have good well-being and flourish. And the assumption that's been made at the moment is, of course, that human innovation is sufficient to fix all of these problems just in time to avoid mass human suffering. And of course, as a precursor to mass human suffering, you're going to have a collapse of the current economy. And so it constantly surprises me to connect it to the big picture side of things again, that, people like pension plans are completely failing to ask the businesses in whom they're investing to think about these contextual factors, which are, the science is very clear, are already and will continue to only get stronger in the implications for business that, as KPMG pointed out back in 2012.
So one of the things that I talked about in my book, Bullshift, which is over here above my shoulder here, is that the industry has this way, the financial services industry has its way of keeping people happy, talking about positive outcomes and thinking about a better tomorrow without really stopping to say, wait a minute, let's take stock of this. This can't be done indefinitely because these are depleting resources. These are finite items, and that there's a real similarity between what governments try to do to try to keep people happy and to vote for them, or if you're an incumbent, and what financial advisors do, which is to try to keep people thinking positive thoughts about the capital markets. So the challenge is that people who invest are also people who vote. It's the same person serving two different masters. And the challenge is almost always one of getting people to act within the context that you talk about. And I'm going to talk about that in this time, it's going to be two different ways. In the context of giving advice with regard to people's portfolios and their investment decisions, but also with regard to people's choices when they're in the ballot box. Because that context is largely overlooked in both instances. And there's it's a bit of a downer for anyone to talk about these things, but it's absolutely imperative that we do so.
So I completely agree with you, Johnny. So it's a real conundrum that we're facing now. I mean, it's part of what makes this a polycrisis, that we've got all of these interdependent, interconnected things going on. And you've just described two of the really critical ones. This is where I shift the conversation away from the problem-seeking, problem-solving mindset and to ask the question, so what is it that we want as individuals, as a species? Why are we here? And the current context of both the political side and of the investment side is there's this assumption we want more of what we've already had. And yet the evidence is really clear. Not only can we almost certainly not have more of what we've already had, and that things are going to get worse if we don't do something different. It's also fairly clear that the things we've been asking for, or we've been given in response to the last time we were asked this question, which was the end of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods conference, the things that we've been asking for actually don't necessarily lead to what the positive psychologists would call flourishing, individually or collectively. And so I would start by suggesting that we need a conversation at that level. And in fact, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, tried to provoke this conversation is part of the marking of the 75th anniversary of the UN in 2020. He actually conducted the world's largest public relations survey to ask this question: what do we want? And it involved hundreds of thousands of people in every country around the world. It was, as I said, the largest public relations survey of its kind that's ever been done. And of course, we know what happened. The results were about to be published, and then COVID happened, and that story disappeared. Whereas what it could have been is the start of the conversation that I believe, still need to have. And the results of that survey were pretty clear that what people want is improved well-being. And many of the things that we've been asking for or have been delivered in response to what we've been asking for in the past don't actually lead to well-being. Wealth is a good example of that. Yes, people need a certain amount of wealth to be comfortable, to be satisfied, to have the possibility for flourishing. There's no doubt about it. Money is very important for that. But beyond a certain amount, it actually doesn't make much of a difference based on the research that's out there. And this is part of the non-rational decision making. People will often make decisions that are not rational as far as, or not logical as far as optimizing their wealth is concerned. And that's partly because they actually know instinctively at some level, sometimes at least, that is not a precursor. Similarly, the politicians, unfortunately, we've trained our politicians to not be leaders anymore. Our politicians now are managers of the crisis that is unfolding. And so they've stopped feeling able to ask the big questions. And even Mark Carney, I would say, while he has done a better job at acknowledging the crisis in which we're now facing the most, he has not stepped up to ask Canadians the big question. What should Canada look like in 30 years? He said we need lots of infrastructure, but what should it look like in 30 years? What does reconciliation look like in 30 years' time? What does our economy look like in 30 years' time? And what does our society look like in 30 years' time? And so and why would we want our society to look like that? What's the overall objective?
And the irony of that, I find, is that you cited COVID a few moments ago in 2020, and now here we are from 2024 to the present, where we have a news threat which is seemingly existential coming from the United States with regard to tariffs and sovereignty and what have you. Mm-hmm. So all of the long-term, truly existential concerns are being subsumed by the immediacy of things that are in the here and now. But if you're constantly putting out fires in the here and now, you never have the bandwidth to stop and reflect more purposefully about the longer term implications of the decisions you have to make and what it is you want. And so we round and round, and we never make progress.
So I believe it was Naomi Klein who came up with the following analogy. She called it the lifeboat model. So she said that basically what's happening now is that each country is getting into a lifeboat of their own making, and there are people swimming around in the ocean trying to upturn that lifeboat. Other countries potentially coming in with their oars, other individuals arriving, and people are getting so afraid that all they can do is use the oars to push the other people away. And so this is exactly what Carney's been saying, and that we need to work to avoid that happening. But I believe that is the current immediate crises are distracting people from the fact that the ocean itself, literally and figuratively, is getting rougher and rougher, and there are storm clouds, some of which are already arriving on a fairly regular basis that never used to arrive, and there are more on the horizon that are considerably worse. And yet we're also busy, using our oars to fend off the people who are trying to arrive and the other boats who are trying to crash into us. So tariffs would be an example of that. That we don't have any energy to look at the bigger picture.
So from your perspective, what sorts of things, you don't have to name products or anything, but what sorts of things should investors be looking toward going forward that will make their portfolios more resilient, more able to withstand these rocky oceans?
So I would say two parts to that question. So the first part is look for opportunities to invest locally in things that are local. So those are things that are generally not very accessible through traditional markets anymore. We used to have a stock market in every town. You could invest in a local business by going down to the local stock market and investing. Can't do that anymore because in the name of efficiency, we now have much fewer stock markets, and they're much harder for smaller companies to get listed in. So that would be the first thing I would say, to think about local. People who are in a locality care about that place in a way that people who are far away don't care about it. They will make better decisions. They'll keep the local economy going. So as things do start to fall apart, then local economic resilience is going to become really important. And then the second thing I would say in general is look to the basics. So if you take the Maslow hierarchy of needs and you take the lower levels of subsistence and shelter, and even some of the higher level ones, think about businesses that are working in ways that integrate social benefit, environmental regeneration, and financial performance as regards to particularly the lower layers of the hierarchy. So, avoid, people investing in African land, for example. That would be a bad idea. Find people who are trying to enable the rebuilding of Canadian-owned and operated farms that are going to look after the environment. That would be an example.
So I can't help but think about how when you mention Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of the things that people talk about in 2026 frequently, both political commentators and economic commentators, is the so-called K-shaped economy. And so we have the winners, the top 1%, and frankly, maybe even the top 5 or 10% of society that are on the upward slope of the K. They're the ones that are self-actualizing or they have desires to self-actualize because they're at the top of the hierarchy. And then everyone else, the other 90% of the population, is still dealing with the food, shelter, and clothing. That's a bit of an oversimplification. But as society bifurcates and goes in these opposite directions, I can't help but think that that's going to be a real challenge for social cohesion going forward. And,
absolutely.
Yeah,
okay. It's pretty. I mean, I think that Connie again has brought up the question of what's the future of the middle class. I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion about do we have a middle class anymore? Exactly based on that bifurcation that you've spoken about. I think I might question whether or not the people on the upper slope in the main are actively trying to self-actualize, or whether they believe that by accruing power and money to themselves, they somehow can achieve that, which again, all the evidence from positive psychology, as an example, would suggest that those are not well-known paths for self-actualization.
It's the naive assumption that wealth is a proxy for self-actualization. And
That's
I
right.
agree that they're very different things.
Yes.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating theoretical discussion, but we have to wrap up here. So the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. If it was up to you, Anthony, what advice would you give people to help them make better wealth decisions?
So if you're a business leader or an entrepreneur, I would say you need to think about the future of your business model. And that's where the bulk of my work is focused. So please come and have a look at our website, flourishingbusiness.org, and learn about how you can start to think about flourishing business models. If you're an investor, then I would say start seeking out businesses that are actively asking themselves, how can we generate social benefit, regenerate the environment, and achieve an appropriate financial return on the investor's investment.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
You're very welcome, John. Glad to be here. Thank you.
If you're worried about the current investment climate and your money, go to my website to book a call for personalized advice to assist you in feeling secure and protected about your retirement.